and welcome to my Sunday dining room table and the stories that I hope you'll love. Jack Allen, he's usually talking to us about his songwriter grandmother, Toni Beaulieu, but today he's in LA and he's waiting to take you and me on a most unusual and fascinating tour. There are tours of movie star homes, and there are tours of infamous murder sites. There are all kinds of tours built around famous stars, but only one of the celebrity cemeteries in Los Angeles delivers more intrigue per plot than any other. That's a place that's often called the Great Hollywood Secret. It's Westwood Village Memorial Park. It actually began as Sunset Cemeteries back in 1818. And of course, that was long before motion pictures were even invented. Well, back then, this space served a rural population and workers at a small teaching college. But in 1919, that college became the University of California, Los Angeles, better known as UCLA. And Westwood Village was developed nearby in the late 1920s. So the name of the cemetery was changed. Now, if in listening to Jack, you think his voice is familiar, well, you may have heard him on TV introducing classic movies. He is recognized as an authentic Hollywood historian. And now he's waiting to tell some inside stories about famous residents of Westwood Village Memorial Park. Okay, Jack, we're ready. Just take it away.
Hi, everybody. This is Jack Allen, historian with the Hollywood You Don't Know. And I invite you to join me today as I rub elbows with some of Hollywood's biggest names. Now, the big names I'm talking about are all deceased, but they're all right here at Westwood Cemetery in Los Angeles. This is one of Hollywood's best-kept secrets, I think, and I thought you ought to know about it. It's the highest concentration of stars of any place I've ever seen, but it's only 2.5 acres in size. It's a small, unpretentious cemetery, lovely garden environment, and it always seems to leave me in a more peaceful state of mind than when I got here. If you live in LA, it's great, but if you're planning a trip, I think it's definitely worth a couple hours visit. The situation here at the Westwood Cemetery is a rather phenomenal one. Put simply, the stars who reside at the cemetery or who have chosen it as their final resting place did so only after another very famous star made it chic by moving in first. I'm, of course, referring to Marilyn Monroe, who passed away in 1962. Anyway, today I'm going to share some of the facts about this place, who's here, a little bit of the history behind it, how Marilyn got here, and I'll be walking through the cemetery as we go, introducing some of the famous folks who are buried here. It's interesting when you learn that Marilyn is the reason that many of these people are here in the first place. Yes, there were some who worked with her, who knew her personally, but the phenomenon is, how did all these people get here who didn't seem to know her? I mean, there seems to be an attraction. Maybe Marilyn was an inspiration. Maybe it was the troubled life she led or her early passing that had something to do with it. But there seems to be a connection because this cemetery has only been here since 1888. But the stars that reside here did not do so until 1962. After 1962, they followed Marilyn here. This cemetery was originally called the Sunset Cemetery when it started back in 1888, which was before movies were even invented. UCLA was founded in 1920 or so, and the Westwood Village name took its place, the Sunset Cemetery. It is currently called, the Westwood Cemetery is, the full name for the place is the Pierce Brothers Westwood Village Memorial Park, okay? But that's a bit wordy. To walk into the cemetery, to find it, you have to enter on Glendon Avenue, right here in Westwood, which is where I'm standing, at Wilshire Boulevard, and It's the only entrance. We'll see like a bank building on the corner. It's very built up. You turn the corner, and it looks like the cemetery was playing hide and go seek and got lost. It's just suddenly right there. The last place you'd expect to see a cemetery. And since there's only one way to get into it, there's only one way to get out of it. So it's sort of sealed. It's kind of private. And it's very interesting. It does not have the feel of other cemeteries that you have visited before. If you're wondering how Marilyn got here in the first place, she was reared by foster parents, as you probably know. She didn't have a father that stayed with the mother. Her mother was mentally ill and was treated in a mental institution for most of her life. So Marilyn was raised by foster parents, and those foster parents died and were buried at the cemetery. And that is what started Marilyn Monroe association with the cemetery. Grace Goddard, who was her godmother and who gave her the inspiration to be an actress, is buried here. And her Aunt Anna, which was Grace's aunt, Aunt Anna Lauer, who was like a grandmother to Marilyn, one of the few people that she said she really loved in her life. Anyway, when Aunt Lauer died, Marilyn visited her frequently at the cemetery. She even brought Joe DiMaggio with her on occasion. And that is how Joe DiMaggio knew this to be the cemetery when Marilyn passed away. Anna Lauer bought the first, interestingly, her family bought the first burial plot at the cemetery, plot number 5. And so it really was the very beginning of the cemetery. But the interesting thing to me here is how all of these people, mostly stars, but a whole lot of people from the entertainment industry who worked in the business, how did they all know to come here? Yes, Marilyn was famous, but what motivated them? Because they not only made arrangements for their burial here, many of them transferred loved ones from other cemeteries here. Fanny Brice, for example, who died in 1951, is buried here. But she was already cremated and at a Jewish Home of Peace cemetery in East LA at the time of, she was there since 1951. Marilyn got here in 1962, but it wasn't until 1992 or so that Fanny Brice's daughter transferred Fanny Brice to the cemetery. Now, Fanny's daughter lives here, her son-in-law, who was Ray Stark, who famously produced the movies Funny Girl and Funny Lady about his famous mother-in-law. Ray Stark, by the way, ran a film program at the USC Film School where I went to school, and it was a very popular but exclusive film program. Today, the whole family, Fanny Brice's whole family, is buried here at the cemetery. As you begin to take a tour of the cemetery, you have to start here at the entrance, and the first thing you'll see is the Arm & Hammer crypt. That's the first prominent gravesite. He was an industrialist, of course, who ran an oil company right down the street. He's probably most famous for his Hammer Museum, which is in the same building, and you can go there and see an extraordinary collection of impressionistic paintings. In fact, if you are interested in coming and visiting the cemetery as a tourist, you might very well want to stop at the Arm & Hammer Museum at the same time. He opened the museum in 1990 and then died 2 weeks later of cancer. So Arm & Hammer is right here. I'm going to just walk around and name some of the names that are here. Truman Capote was a celebrated author of In Cold Blood. He is here. He was a friend of Marilyn's. She used to attend his white party in New York. He also claimed to have written Breakfast at Tiffany's for her. And on the set of the movie with Audrey Hepburn, he said something to the effect of, "You're not right for this part. I wrote this for Marilyn Monroe." I guess Audrey Hepburn was a bit miscast as Holly Golightly because she was anything but a prostitute, in my opinion. She was so sweet and so wonderful and charismatic in the movie, but Truman Capote did not think she was the right image of a prostitute. And he was probably right on that, but she was certainly wonderful anyway. Right here on Truman Capote's gravestone, it says, under the dates, it says, beloved friends, Joanne Carson. Joanne Carson was the ex-wife of Johnny Carson. She was a nurse who was one of Capote's closest friends. And he was nearing the end of his life. He had been an alcoholic most of his life, and he knew that his time was about up. And Joanna Carson agreed to let him stay with her at her home in Hollywood till his death, which he did. But as you can see from the gravestone, after she played host to him, he reciprocated here at the cemetery, because now Joanna Carson is buried with Truman Capote for eternity at Westwood Cemetery. This is what I mean. There's very interesting kinds of things going on here in terms of the personal relationships and some of the personal issues that the people who inhabit this place had. The next person here is Heather O'Rourke. She was Carol Ann in the movie Poltergeist. They're here! Sadly died in surgery at the age of 12. And at the same cemetery is the actress who played her older sister in Poltergeist, Dominique Dunne. It was her first big break in a film, only 22 years old when she was strangled by her ex-boyfriend and died at the age of 22. I mean, a tragic story. He was convicted of manslaughter and got 3.5 years in jail, which triggered a controversial situation that her father, the writer, Dominic Dunne, got involved in. But it's just so sad. And on this subject with these girls who died too soon, there's another girl buried here, Dorothy Stratton. You may recall her story. She was a Canadian Playboy playmate who in 1980, she was just embarking on a whole new film career and TV career. She was murdered by her estranged husband and manager, who then committed suicide later in the day. She was only 20 years old. Another case of a young talent that was just on the cusp of budding and taken down so young. Did they have a connection with Marilyn in this regard? Why are they here? You know? Here's Ava Gabor from Green Acres, one of many TV stars that are here. She died on July 4th, 1995, it says on her tombstone, but she did not say what year she was born. The Gabors did not like revealing their age. Zsa, her sister, was buried in Budapest, but there were Ava Gabor predeceased her. Zsa lived to be 99 years old. In fact, 9 is the magic number for Zsa. She was married 9 times as well. She appeared in a Marilyn movie called We're Not Married, and so there's the connection with Marilyn. But she was buried in Budapest, and some of her ashes were placed here with her sister, Ava Gabor. So technically, this is a grave site. Nearby is Eddie Albert, who co-starred with Ava Gabor in Green Acres. He made movies, too. He was a terrific talent. He was a war hero. In the Navy, I believe he won the Bronze Star for rescuing Marines who were under fire. So he was somebody with a military record as well. And he, like Zsa, lived to be 99 years old. So I'm continuing my little stroll across the cemetery toward Marilyn Monroe's grave, which is where I'm going to conclude my visit today eventually. And when I get there, I want to share a thought about Marilyn that I hope you'll take to heart. It's been 60 years now. 60 years since Marilyn died. And make no mistake about it, her death was a homicide, not a suicide. As I point out some of the celebrities along the way, I'd also like to mention some of the music artists who are buried here. Mel Torme is a singer who is very popular, one of Marilyn's favorites. He's buried here. Hefner was one of his buddies. I used to see them out on the weekends, different events. He was a great talent. Danny Sugarman is buried here. He was a fan who became the manager of the Doors, and he wrote their biography. And his gravestone here includes the Aldous Huxley quote, from which the Doors were actually named. It says, "There are things known and things unknown, and in between are the Doors." So anyway, that is kind of fun. Buddy Rich, the famous drummer, is here. You usually see his drumsticks in the water vase that's next to the grave. Sammy Cahn, the lyric writer who wrote mostly for Sinatra, he was nominated for an Academy Award 31 times and won 4 Oscars. He's buried here. Great lyric writer. He wrote Call Me Irresponsible, All the Way, High Hopes. Oscar Levant was an extraordinary classical pianist, sensational performer, but he also had an acting contract at MGM, playing characters along Gene Kelly and other musical personalities in the storylines of his movies that he was in. Sensational performer, but he was also, he had a problem with bipolarity through his life that was a challenge, but he is also known as the guy who first referred to Hollywood as Tinseltown. He coined that Tinseltown word. I believe his original quote was, "Peel away the phony tinsel from this town, and you know what you'll find? Real tinsel," or something like that. But it was, Tinseltown was his word. Carl Wilson of the Beach Boys is here. Minnie Riperton, who had a 5-octave range in the 70s, is here. Peggy Lee, my favorite singer-songwriter, is here. Patty Andrews of the Andrews Sisters. And, I mean, there's a lot of musical people. And we're going to mention Dean Martin. Continuing the stars across the cemetery, right here at the top, Daryl Zanuck. This is the head of the studio, 20th Century Fox, who took Marilyn's screen test and signed her to a contract at Fox. Then he later decided she wasn't photogenic. I don't know where he came up with that, but she was dropped. She went to Columbia, and thanks to Johnny Hyde, a very smart agent and influential at the William Morris Agency, she got the couple of movies that jump-started the rest of her career. Marilyn made 17 films before she starred. That's a lot of bit parts and stuff, but she was good. But she had to have quite a bit of patience because she made a lot of movies before she got a chance to be a star. Now we come to a lady who is probably the most famous star here, Natalie Wood. Her gravestone says Natalie Wood Wagner. Another sad death that came too soon. At age 43 for her in an incident first thought to be an accident, but now believed to be a homicide. It's a sad story, but she was a wonderful, wonderful talent. I used to love Miracle on 34th Street when I was a kid. But she went on to do so many movies, West Side Story, Rebel Without a Cause, on and on. A real sad story, a tragic end for her. Right next to Natalie Wood here is Terry McQueen, who was the daughter of Steve McQueen, who died. Steve McQueen had just passed away, and his daughter kept a vial of her dad's ashes. Then she proceeded to, she had cancer, and she died after a liver transplant. So then her ashes were buried together with her father's. So her grave is the only real official grave of Steve McQueen, if you want to think of it as that. When people are cremated, there are a number of people who came to the cemetery to be cremated, and then the ashes would be sprinkled at sea or some other place or favorite location. Then there would be no grave at this cemetery. So that's another option when you check into the Westwood Cemetery. And so in the case of Steve McQueen, there are no graves with his name on them. But Terry McQueen, his daughter, has his ashes, so this is the place to come if you want to pay your respects to Steve McQueen. Another weird story with Bob Crane, who was the star of Hogan's Heroes. He was murdered in 1978 in Arizona, But he and his wife, Sigrid Valdez, she played Colonel Klink's secretary, Hilda, on the Hogan's Heroes TV show. They were separated. The marriage was in trouble because he had been messing around with other girls, and he was involved in amateur porn production. When he was murdered, he was buried at Oakwood Cemetery in Chatsworth for 20 years, until once again his wife and family decided to move him here to Westwood. And I don't know, I don't understand it, but they did. And the wife did one of the nicest, this has got to be one of the kindest gestures I've ever heard from a wife. In a situation like this, she created a brand new black and white gravestone with her image and his image together, with poetry she wrote pledging her eternal love. It's so wonderful, a resolution to a very sad story. I tend to think that she was probably trying to dispel some bad energy or some bad confrontations between them. I don't know, but boy, did she fix that in a nice way. It's just beautiful. When you see Bob Crane's and Sigrid's tombstone here, it's very moving. It really is. Also here is Betty May Page. That is Betty Page, the pinup girl. She ended up here thanks to Hugh Hefner, who kind of bailed her out in her career where she wasn't getting money for the work she had done, the photographic pinup work she had done. He helped her get compensated so that by her death, she had an estate like Marilyn's going with her imagery. Sadly, like Marilyn's mother, she suffered from mental illness. Betty Page suffered from schizophrenia and spent years in a mental hospital, which was very similar to Marilyn's mother. It's very interesting. Also, Betty Page converted to Christianity in the 70s and worked as a secretary to Billy Graham, the evangelist, and later remarked that she felt that was from her resume, that was one of her favorite, proudest moments, which is kind of interesting, too. Donna Reed is here, wonderful actress, had her own show, It's a Wonderful Life. She played Jimmy Stewart's wife, and, of course, the movie From Here to Eternity. Burt Lancaster is right nearby, and he also was in From Here to Eternity with her. Peter Fonda from Easy Rider, part of the counterculture of the 60s, is here. So it's really a mix of some big talent. Along with the other actors, Don Knotts, who was a very funny TV star, is here with a wonderful plaque with all of his characters on it. It has, Mr. Limpet when he played a fish, and you've got to see this this plaque that Don Knotts has on his grave. It's a wonderful tribute to his wonderful career, and I don't see Mr. Furley from Three's Company here, but this is a really beautiful tribute. I tripped over his grave here on a previous occasion, and I kind of got shocked a little bit because I was here shortly after Don Knotts. I had seen Don Knotts at an event, and he was signing autographs like a madman at a table, and his fans were snaking out the door. He was so overworked, and he couldn't even look up from his signing. And a couple months later, I tripped over his grave here. I looked down, and it was the plaque, and I went, God, life is so short. This is weird. But it really is. It's strange. Eve Arden is buried here. I love Eve Arden. She was one of the greatest comic character actresses ever. She made a movie with Marilyn. That's her connection, I guess, here. We're Not Married was a movie she made with Marilyn. She had a gift that you don't hear much about today. It's called wit. You really don't hear much about it, but she had it in spades. David Wayne is an actor who was in some Marilyn movies. His grave is right here. He was in How to Marry a Millionaire. He was in We're Not Married. He was in 4 films, actually. So that makes David Wayne the winner of the most Marilyn movie award. He is the person who is in the most Marilyn movies. So that's a trivia question. The answer is 4, David Wayne. Dean Martin, of course, was a fan of Marilyn's and worked with her in her last film, in which they never finished, Something's Gotta Give. because she passed away. He's buried here in the Sanctuary of Love, and I'm looking at a white tombstone covered in red lipstick kisses. Doesn't seem quite appropriate since he has an ex-wife that is buried just a few feet away. But our second wife is buried here. But he was a popular guy. And the last movie, Something's Got to Give, Marilyn was sick a great deal during the shooting of that film. And the studio was trying to close down the production so they could collect the insurance, I think. Anyway, they hired Lee Remick to replace Marilyn, but Dean Martin would have none of it. He said, I was hired, I was signed to work with Marilyn Monroe, and that's who I'm going to work with. So the movie was not finished because obviously Marilyn passed away. Lee Remick is buried here too, and she's a splendid actress, and I had the pleasure of working with her on a TV movie in Canada. It was a fabulous experience, but right after she finished the movie, she was diagnosed with cancer of the kidneys and lungs and died in 1991. She was a luminous star and a tremendous lady, and she's here. Peter Lawford is here too, from the Rat Pack. He was not exactly the most popular member of the Rat Pack by the time he died. He actually died on Christmas Eve at the age of 61 from cardiac arrest. He had suffered from kidney and liver failure after years of substance abuse, and he was cremated, but then he was evicted from the cemetery. I mean, truly, the cemetery had some kind of dispute with his widow, his wife of the time, Patricia Seaton, and his ashes were taken out of here and scattered into the Pacific Ocean, and that was that. Peter Lawford, unfortunately, was involved in the storytelling about Marilyn and her alleged suicide, which was fabricated. And he really, at the end of his life, that came back to roost. He was haunted by his things he had done regarding Marilyn, at least according to his wives who documented it. There's two wonderful TV actors that I want to mention here because they're both here. Tim Conway, they're both comic sketch artists, comedians. Tim Conway from the Carol Burnett Show, who was a wonderful comedian. And Flip Wilson, I want to mention, Flip Wilson was the first African-American TV host to star in a successful variety show, which he did in NBC. It was called The Flip Wilson Show. He was funny as anything. And according to Time Magazine, he was the first black superstar. So, but all I can say is, if you don't know Flip Wilson, go to YouTube or whatever and check out his work. Magnificent guy. Just a legend. There's so many other directors, designers, writers, composers, agents here. I mean, other than the big A-list stars, there's lots of people behind the scenes that also gravitated to this particular cemetery after 1962. And their names are all around us. By the way, I say agent, Swifty Lazar is here, the super agent. He used to give parties every year at Spago with the Academy Award. And he was called Swifty Lazar because the nickname stuck after he booked 5 film deals for one of his clients in one day. I believe it was Humphrey Bogart. That's pretty swift. Everybody's here from behind the scenes too. I can't even get through the A-list stars here and mention them all. Jim Backus is here from Gilligan's Island. He was Mr. Magoo. And speaking of animation, June Foray is here. She lived to be 90-something, and she was the voice of Rocky J. Squirrel. Wonderful, wonderful talent. Louis Jourdan is here. His son died at the age of 30, and he's here. I mean, there are so many connections with families, parental units, I'm looking at the feature stars. We're moving into the section here. This is the final high rent area of the cemetery, which is where a lot of the top stars are. People like Kirk Douglas and his son Eric, Sage Stallone, who was Sylvester Stallone's 36-year-old son who died of arterial sclerosis. Sadly, Carol O'Connor, who was Archie Bunker. His son Hugh O'Connor had a addiction problem and died by suicide. Brian Keith, star of Family Affair. His daughter Daisy was 27 when she committed suicide. She was an actress who would work with her dad, was working with her dad, and 2 months later, he shot himself to death. So, in fairness, he was suffering from lung cancer, so he was in pain, and but I mean, it's all these stories are so similar and so heartbreaking. And by the way, Brian Keith's father was a man named Robert Keith. He, in 1932, dated another very famous suicide, which was Peg Entwistle, who is famous in Hollywood lore from jumping off the Hollywood sign because she didn't have a voice that adapted to sound. Peg Entwistle was involved with Robert Keith. It's strange. And of course, there's other people. Peter Falk is here, Jack Klugman, David Nelson from Ozzie and Harriet. I mean, Florence Henderson from the Brady Bunch, Doris Roberts from Everybody Loves Raymond, Farrah Fawcett from Charlie's Angels. Good God. And on it goes. A lot of stars. Some of these, some of the messages on their tombstones are pretty funny. I'm looking at Rodney Dangerfield here. His gravestone says, "There goes the neighborhood." And that's funny. A lot of the graves in this part of the cemetery, which is here at the southern end of the Westwood Village, they often go for $200,000 and up. It's pricey real estate. Jack Lemmon is here, and his tombstone says, "Jack Lemmon in," like his credits do in the movies. Walter Matthau is here nearby. Billy Wilder is here nearby. Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau made 10 pictures together. So it's like a family reunion at the cemetery, I swear. I think my favorite epitaph is actually Merv Griffin's. Merv Griffin is here. His epitaph says, "I will not be right back after this message." Merv Griffin, of course, had his own talk show, and he said that about 10 times a night. We'll be back right after this message. But he also invented a little thing called Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune. And fortune is what it led to. Richard Dawson is also buried here. Another game show guy, Family Feud. So, I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing the number of people. I'm turning around, and I saw a little earlier, and I saw Ray Bradbury's gravestone, and I didn't notice it before. But I knew Ray Bradbury. I had the honor of knowing Ray Bradbury through an employer that I had at a producer I knew. And he was a really tremendous individual. On his tombstone here, it says, Ray Bradbury, born in 1920, author of Fahrenheit 451. And that's all it says. But as I started thinking about it, he didn't say what date he died, but after you say that you wrote Fahrenheit 451, it's kind of like saying, you don't need to know when I died because I'm immortal. I mean, that's really what it's kind of saying. And he only states the one credit. I mean, he wrote 600 stories, short stories in his career, and many more novels and etc. The Martian Chronicles, for one thing. But Fahrenheit 451 was probably his biggest spectacular classic about futuristic burning of books. He was fascinated by the fact that Hitler and Stalin, burned books for their own purposes. Well, he wrote the whole story at UCLA Library, dropping dimes. They used to have a typewriter room where you could sit down, and for 30 minutes, you could spend a dime, and you could type for 30 minutes. So he wrote Fahrenheit 451 in 9 days, dropping dimes. It was like $9 and some odd cents, he said, to write this sensational play. And here we are, right here with the family who published the book. His big hit book, Fahrenheit 451, was actually first appeared in Playboy magazine in 1954. Mr. Hefner. Okay? Wow. It's like coming full circle. And by the way, Ray Bradbury originally called it The Fireman, was the title for the book. He called the fire department and asked them if they knew at what temperature books would catch fire. And they somehow knew the answer at 451 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the auto ignition temperature of paper. Well, the rest was Ray Bradbury. There's more people that I'm hoping to speak of and be able to cover in the future chapters of this show that time doesn't permit now. Along this eastern wall of the cemetery are some famous parents, Sarah and Francis Taylor, who were Elizabeth Taylor's parents, and Guy and Angela Crocetti, which were Dean Martin's parents, that deserve mentioning. And as we approach Marilyn's crypt now, we're passing Robert Stack, who was interred in the Room of Prayer. He was the host of Unsolved Mysteries and made many movies in his career. And this brings us right to Marilyn and to her neighbor now, Hugh Hefner. I had the pleasure of working with Mr. Hefner as I was involved I was doing digital restoration of some of Marilyn's famous photos, and I was working with a pal on her Red Velvet collection, and that was the cornerstone of Hefner's empire, if you think about it. That image of Marilyn was in the first issue of Playboy magazine, and she graced the cover. So in a way, they like to call her the first bunny, but I don't think Marilyn would cotton to that characterization. But nevertheless, Playboy was an important part of her beginning, and Hefner was key in that process. And when I was supposed to meet Mr. Hefner, I was a little concerned because I thought, he's not going to wear that red smoking jacket. I thought this is very peculiar, this persona that he has. And then I met him at the Playboy Mansion, and he was everything the opposite of what I expected. And I want to mention that because I've read some things about him that weren't very savory, and all I can say is my experience with Hefner was absolutely amazing. He was an extraordinary individual. I gleaned that he had a lot of class and a lot of respect for Marilyn, and admitted freely that he had only met her one time, and that was by phone, that he never saw her in person. He wished he had had an opportunity to know her, and it would have been in the kind of a relationship he seemed to have with some of these other girls, in which he really kind of came to the rescue and helped them out a great deal. Playboy certainly was a substantial accomplishment in Marilyn's resume because it changed the dynamic of her life. But the truth of the matter was that it was all founded on utter respect from Mr. Hefner. So I remember what a pro Hef was in our business dealings. I remember a letter he wrote me that was just a business correspondence in which he started it by saying, "Dear Jack, thank you for your prompt reply to my prompt reply." And that sums it up in a word. If you wrote him a note on Monday, he'd have it answered by Wednesday. He was old school professional. And it was sad for me to see that he lived to see the collapse of his own business of the magazine. I thought that was very sad because it really and truly was an empire that he built, and that he built from the brick of that Marilyn image on Red Velvet. It's kind of cool. Anyway, allegedly, Hugh Hefner paid $75,000 for the crypt next to Marilyn's, which he now inhabits. There are a variety of people surrounding Marilyn. Her crypt is easy to find because it's sort of a pink-colored, rose-colored stone, and her husband bought it for her when they married. Joe DiMaggio bought it for Marilyn, 2 crypts when they got married, and they were divorced 9 months later. So he sold his. He sold his to a gentleman who wanted to, it turned out, be buried above Marilyn Monroe, and he asked his wife if she would have him reversed in his grave so that he could be facing her. Okay? Now, that's a little bit strange, but according to the story, she did that. She said she stood there while the mortician turned him around in his casket, or however that was done. And it struck me as very peculiar. Talking about turning over in your grave. But I mean, I really, I guess it takes all kinds. And truthfully, a sexy burial, I don't know, it just doesn't appeal to me on some level. But whatever is the bottom line. His wife tried to, in later years, tried to resell the crypt because she needed the money for her mortgage. Famously, it was listed on eBay, but supposedly got $4 million, got up to $4 million. Well, it didn't sell. It must have been the person who couldn't come up with the money, so it never happened. So I think she still has it. But anyway, that's the moral of the story on Marilyn's neighbors here at Westwood Cemetery. But it's kind of sad when you think when Marilyn died, there was nobody around to claim her body. There was nobody in her life. She didn't have a husband at that time. She had divorced her last husband, and there was nobody even in her family to claim her body. A star of that magnitude, of that fame, and it took Joe DiMaggio, who had remained a friend. He was still in touch with her, and he had hopes. He told friends that they would remarry. He said that they had talked about specific plans. We'll never know whether that's true. But the point is, he made it clear to friends that it was murder. He claimed that he knew. He already knew who did it. And but that it was clearly not suicide. She was not despondent. He was talking to her every day. And that's true. All the people who knew Marilyn said that she was upbeat because she had been fired by the studio and broken off talks with the studios, but they had resumed those talks, and she was rehired, and she had a new contract, and she was looking forward to it. And that seems to be substantiated by everybody who talked to her in her last days. So she is not, there were certain people that put out messages that were false stories, like Peter Lawford, that tried to create a scenario that she was depressed, etc. That was false, okay? And one of the things I'm going to try to do and suggest here right now while we're here at Marilyn's Crypt is that each and every one of you listening to me make a pledge to, it's 60 years later, we know what happened with Marilyn. It was not suicide. Please don't let people in the media especially, like to call Marilyn the star who took her own life. She didn't take her life. That's for sure. Some people say we'll never know what really happened that day to Marilyn Monroe. That's not accurate. History tells us very specifically we know what she was doing every hour of her life. We know what King Tut had for lunch. Trust me, we know what happened. The point is, will we ever be able to accept it? Do we want to know? Are we able to cope with the truth? That's our problem, not hers. She did her life. And I think after 60 years, it's time for us to make this pledge, to no longer accept the falsehood that Marilyn killed herself when she did not. And in future chapters of this show, we'll be talking about some of the specifics. God knows I've researched this subject for a very long time, and I'm pretty clear on it. And I think I understand some of the points of confusion and reason why people are confused about it, and I'm sure we can clarify those things. But for now, I just hope that we can make this promise to Marilyn here and now. Because, trust me, Marilyn lived her life courageously and in every way you can imagine. And she certainly doesn't deserve to be treated like she was a coward at the end of it.
Well, thank you, Jack. And if you enjoyed the tour and the inside stories, we really would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel. It's free, and it would mean the world to us. And I want to thank Jack for letting us use the original theme written by his grandmother, Toni Beaulieu. She's been gone a very long time now, but somehow I suspect she knows what Jack's doing, and and getting her music heard and appreciated. And speaking of appreciating talent, if you haven't seen Jack's coffee table book, Marilyn by Moonlight, boy, are you missing a remarkable treat. So, till next time, bye-bye, Jack, and God bless everybody at our Sunday dinner table.